The Montana morning air carried the bite of early autumn as Police Chief Robert Martinez stepped out of his patrol car at Clearwater Ridge shooting range. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, each step echoing in the vast silence that seemed to swallow the world whole out here, 30 miles from the nearest town. He'd driven out to check on old Pete Hendricks, the range owner, after reports of unusual activity from a concerned neighbor who lived 5 miles down the mountain road. Martinez adjusted his duty belt and surveyed the property. 3 concrete shooting benches sat at measured intervals, facing downrange toward targets set at various distances. The longest markers stretched out to 200 meters, though Pete always bragged that his range could accommodate shots twice that distance if someone had the skill and equipment. The sound that had brought Martinez here reached his ears again, the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle, followed by the satisfying ring of metal on metal. Someone was hitting targets with mechanical precision, shot after shot, with barely 15 seconds between rounds. As Martinez rounded the small wooden shack that served as Pete's office, he saw the source of the neighbor's concern. A man in his early 40s sat behind the center bench, his frame lean but solid, wearing a faded army surplus jacket and blue jeans. The rifle before him made Martinez pause mid-step. It was a Barrett M82A1, a 50-caliber anti-material rifle that weighed nearly 30 pounds and cost more than most people's cars. The weapon lay across the bench like a sleeping predator, its muzzle brake designed to tame the enormous recoil that would otherwise break a normal person's shoulder. The man behind the rifle moved with an economy of motion that spoke of countless hours of practice. He worked the bolt, chambered another round, and settled into his shooting position with fluid precision. His breathing slowed, became measured. Martinez found himself holding his own breath as he watched. The rifle spoke with authority, a sound like thunder rolling across the mountains. Through his binoculars, Martinez watched a steel plate at what had to be the 800-meter mark ring and sway. The man worked the bolt again, ejecting the spent brass, which tumbled through the air and landed with a metallic ping on the concrete. "Impressive shooting," Martinez called out, making sure to announce his presence well before approaching the armed man. The stranger turned, and Martinez got his first good look at the shooter's face. Weathered skin spoke of time spent outdoors, and gray eyes held a depth that suggested he'd seen things most people never would. A closely trimmed beard showed streaks of premature silver. When he smiled, it was polite but guarded. "Morning, officer." The man's voice carried a slight rasp, as if he'd spent years speaking over the noise of engines and gunfire. "I hope I'm not disturbing anyone. Pete said I could use the range as long as I cleaned up after myself." "Chief Martinez," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Jake Sullivan." The handshake was firm, calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. "Just passing through, thought I'd get some trigger time in. Been a while since I've had access to a proper range." Martinez nodded toward the Barrett. "That's some serious hardware for recreational shooting. Most folks around here make do with hunting rifles." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Old habits die hard, I suppose. This rifle and I, we have history." The way he said it made Martinez's cop instincts prick up, but not in an alarming way. There was respect in how Sullivan handled the weapon, reverence even. This wasn't someone playing with military surplus. This was someone who understood exactly what he held and what it could do. "Military?" Martinez asked. "Army. Long time ago." Sullivan began breaking down the rifle with practiced efficiency, each movement deliberate and sure. "You serve?" "Marines. 2 tours in Iraq, back in the early days." Martinez found himself relaxing despite the imposing weapon. There was something about Sullivan that spoke of shared experience, of understanding that only came from wearing the uniform. As Sullivan packed the Barrett into a custom hard case, Martinez noticed something that made him look twice. On the inside of the case's lid, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a small collection of military patches and a faded photograph. He could just make out the distinctive crossed rifles of an infantry unit and what looked like a sniper tab. "What kind of distances were you shooting today?" Martinez asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Sullivan glanced up, seemed to weigh his response. "Started at 400, worked my way back, stopped at 200. He paused, looking out toward the distant mountains. "Used to shoot a lot further than that." There was something in his tone, a mixture of pride and something else, regret, maybe, or longing. Martinez found himself wanting to know more about this quiet man, who handled a Barrett like other people, handled a handgun. Chief Martinez couldn't shake his curiosity about Jake Sullivan as he drove back toward town. Something about the man nagged at him. Not in a criminal sense, but in the way a half-remembered name sits on the tip of your tongue. That evening, he found himself in his home office, laptop open, searching through military databases he still had access to from his time as a military liaison for the county sheriff's department. The search for Jake Sullivan and Army Sniper returned dozens of results, but one made him sit forward in his chair. A citation from 2009 buried in a Department of Defense press release about exceptional marksmanship in Afghanistan. The name was right, and when Martinez clicked through to the accompanying photo, he found himself looking at a younger version of the man he'd met at the range. But it was the details in the citation that made Martinez whistle low under his breath. Staff Sergeant Jacob "Jake" Sullivan, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Confirmed kills, 89. Longest recorded engagement, 3,247 meters. The record had been classified for years, only recently declassified as part of routine document releases. 3,247 meters, over 2 miles. Martinez leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he'd just read. He'd known some impressive marksmen in the Marines, but this was beyond impressive. This was legendary. The current world record for a confirmed sniper kill was held by a Canadian at 3,540 meters, but that shot had been taken just a few years ago with the most advanced equipment available. Sullivan's shot had been made over a decade earlier. The citation provided some context. Sullivan had been providing overwatch for a convoy moving through a narrow mountain pass when insurgents had set up an ambush position on a distant ridge. With conventional support unavailable and the convoy pinned down, Sullivan had taken a shot that military ballistics experts later calculated had required him to account for wind speed, elevation, humidity, the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, and a dozen other variables that would challenge even the most sophisticated computer. He'd made the shot on his second attempt. Martinez spent the next hour reading everything he could find about Sullivan's military career. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, multiple commendations for valor, including a Silver Star for actions during a particularly brutal engagement in the Korangal Valley. The man was a legend among snipers, someone whose exploits were whispered about in military circles, with a mixture of awe and disbelief, and he'd been quietly shooting targets at a civilian range in Montana, like any other weekend warrior. The next morning found Martinez back at Clearwater Ridge, arriving just as Sullivan was setting up his equipment. The Barrett lay on the bench again, but today Sullivan had added a spotting scope and what looked like a weather station to measure wind conditions. "Back for more?" Sullivan asked without looking up from his preparations. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." Martinez settled onto the bench beside him, choosing his words carefully. "I did some research last night. Found some interesting reading about a Staff Sergeant Sullivan who served with the Rangers." Sullivan's hands stilled on the rifle's bolt. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the pine trees that bordered the range. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "That was a long time ago," he said finally. 3,247 meters, Martinez said quietly. "I've been trying to wrap my head around that number all night. I mean, I was decent with a rifle in the Corps, but that's something else entirely." Sullivan was quiet for so long that Martinez wondered if he'd pushed too hard. Finally, the former soldier spoke, his voice barely audible over the mountain breeze. "You ever take a life, Chief?" The question came out flat, matter of fact. "Yes," Martinez replied without hesitation. "Line of duty shooting 3 years ago, armed robbery suspect. It was righteous, but it still sits with you," Sullivan finished. "Yeah. Now imagine taking 89 lives. Imagine being so good at killing people from impossible distances that they make you a legend for it. Imagine having your name whispered in the same breath as the greatest killers in military history." Martinez watched as Sullivan's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he worked the bolt on the empty rifle. The motion was still smooth, still professional, but there was something haunted in the repetitive action. "That record you mentioned," Sullivan continued, "that 3,247-meter shot, that was a 19-year-old kid, Taliban fighter, but still just a kid. He was setting up an IED that would have killed a dozen American soldiers, so I did my job. One shot, center mass, and he dropped like a stone." Sullivan set the rifle down and looked out toward the distant mountains, but Martinez could tell he wasn't seeing Montana wilderness. He was seeing something much farther away and much more terrible. "The thing about being really good at something," Sullivan said, "is that people never let you forget it. For 10 years after I got out, people wanted to hear war stories. They wanted to know what it felt like to make impossible shots, to be the guy who could reach out and touch someone from over 2 miles away. They made me into something larger than life." He picked up a piece of spent brass from the bench, rolling it between his fingers. But they never asked what it cost. Chief Martinez found himself returning to the shooting range 3 days later, though he couldn't quite explain why. Something about Jake Sullivan had gotten under his skin, not just the incredible military record, but the quiet pain the man carried like a second shadow. Martinez had seen it before in other veterans, but rarely in someone who seemed so composed on the surface. Sullivan was there again, but today he wasn't shooting. Instead, he sat on the concrete bench with his back to the targets, staring out at the access road as if waiting for something that would never come. The Barrett remained in its case, unopened. "Mind if I join you?" Martinez asked, settling onto the bench without waiting for an answer. Sullivan glanced over, offering a tired smile. "Free country, Chief, though I'm not much for conversation today." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching a red-tailed hawk circle high above the valley. Finally, Martinez spoke. "After I killed that armed robber, I couldn't sleep for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. My department offered counseling, but I was too proud to take it. Thought it made me weak." Sullivan nodded slowly. "How'd you get past it?" "My wife, Sarah. She didn't let me shut down. Made me talk about it, even when I didn't want to. Made me understand that feeling something about taking a life, even a justified kill, meant I was still human. Must be nice," Sullivan said quietly, "having someone who understands." Martinez caught the past tense in Sullivan's voice, but didn't push. Instead, he waited, letting the mountain silence do the work. "I was married once," Sullivan said eventually. "Michelle. Met her right after my second deployment. She was a nurse at the VA hospital where I was getting treatment for some shrapnel wounds. Beautiful woman, kind heart. Patient too, which was good, because I was a mess back then." He picked up a pine cone that had fallen near the bench, turning it over in his hands. "For a while it worked. She helped me adjust to civilian life, got me into college on the GI Bill. I was studying engineering, thought maybe I could build things instead of what I'd been doing. We even talked about kids." The pine cone crumbled in his grip, pieces falling to scatter on the concrete. But then the war documentaries started coming out, the History Channel specials about sniper operations in Afghanistan. Somehow, my story got out there. My record. Journalists started calling, wanting interviews, military contractors offering jobs. Everyone wanted a piece of the legendary Jake Sullivan. Martinez could see where this was heading, and his chest tightened with familiar dread. Michelle tried to understand. But how do you explain to someone that their husband is famous for killing people? That there are online forums where people debate your techniques and argue about your confirmed kill count like they're discussing baseball statistics? Sullivan stood abruptly, walking to the edge of the shooting platform. The final straw was when some magazine wanted to do a feature story. "America's Deadliest Sniper," they were going to call it. They offered serious money and we needed it. College wasn't cheap and I was working part-time at a sporting goods store. He turned back to face Martinez, and for the first time, the careful control in his expression cracked. "She left me the day after that magazine hit the stands. Said she couldn't live with being married to a man who was celebrated for killing. Said every time she looked at me, she wondered how many mothers somewhere in the world were mourning sons I'd put in the ground." The admission hung in the air between them, like smoke from a discharged rifle. Martinez felt the weight of it, understanding now why Sullivan carried himself like a man bearing invisible burdens. "That was 5 years ago," Sullivan continued. "Since then I've been moving from place to place, trying to find somewhere I can just be Jake Sullivan, instead of America's Deadliest Sniper. But the reputation follows me. Someone always recognizes the name, or sees me shoot, or puts the pieces together." He gestured toward the Barrett case. "I keep the rifle because it's all I have left of who I used to be. But every time I fire it, I remember not just the targets I'm hitting now, but every target I hit over there. Every life that ended because I was so damn good at my job." That evening, Chief Martinez sat in his kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His wife Sarah bustled around him, preparing dinner and chatting about her day at the elementary school where she taught third grade, but her voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Robert." Sarah's hand on his shoulder brought him back to the present. "You're somewhere else tonight. Everything okay?" Martinez looked up at his wife of 15 years, taking in her concerned brown eyes and graying hair that she'd started wearing shorter since their youngest had left for college. Sarah had always been his anchor, the one who kept him grounded when the job threatened to pull him under. "I met someone yesterday actually, a veteran." Sarah settled into the chair across from him, recognizing his tone. "Want to talk about it?" Martinez told her about Jake Sullivan, about the Barrett and the record and the pain the man carried like a physical weight. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. "And now I can't stop thinking about him," Martinez concluded. "Here's a man who served his country with distinction, who saved countless American lives with his skills, and he's been punished for it ever since." "What are you thinking of doing?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "I don't know yet, but I can't just walk away." The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Martinez was barely into his first cup of coffee when his radio crackled to life. "Chief, we've got a situation at the Riverside Diner. Armed robbery in progress. Suspect has hostages." Martinez was moving before the transmission ended, grabbing his duty belt and heading for the door. Riverside Diner sat at the intersection of two state highways, a popular stop for truckers and travelers. If someone was desperate enough to rob it at gunpoint, they were probably desperate enough to do something stupid. The scene that greeted Martinez made his blood run cold. Two patrol cars were already on scene, his officers crouched behind their vehicles. Through the diner's large windows, he could see a man in a dirty jacket, waving what looked like a revolver at a half-dozen customers huddled in a booth. "What do we know?" Martinez asked Sergeant Collins, his most experienced officer. "Single suspect. Appeared to be high on something. Came in demanding money from the register, but when the owner couldn't open the safe, he lost it. Started screaming about how he needed the money for some kind of debt. That was 20 minutes ago." Martinez studied the scene through binoculars. The suspect was clearly agitated, pacing back and forth in front of the windows. The hostages looked terrified, but unharmed. It was a volatile situation that could go bad in seconds. "SWAT?" Martinez asked. "State boys are en route, but it'll be 40 minutes before they arrive. This guy doesn't look like he's got 40 minutes of patience left in him." As if to emphasize Collins' point, they could see the suspect suddenly slam his fist on a table, causing several of the hostages to cry out in fear. The man with the gun spun toward them, and Martinez could see him shouting, though they couldn't make out the words through the glass. "Chief," came a familiar voice from behind him. Martinez turned to find Jake Sullivan approaching, hands visible and empty. "Jake, you need to get back. This is an active crime scene." "I heard the sirens from the range," Sullivan said calmly. "Thought you might need help. Appreciate the offer, but this is police business." Sullivan nodded toward the diner. "What's the shot?" The question was asked so matter-of-factly that it took Martinez a moment to understand what Sullivan was suggesting. "Jake, no. Absolutely not. Chief, look at the situation objectively. You've got an unstable suspect with a firearm, multiple hostages, and no clear line of sight for your officers. The angles from here are all wrong. Too much risk of a through-and-through hitting a hostage." Martinez found himself looking at the diner with new eyes, seeing it through the lens of Sullivan's expertise. The man was right. Any shot his officers could take would be at an extreme angle, with civilians in the potential line of fire. "But from the ridge behind the diner," Sullivan continued, "there's a clear field of fire, maybe 300 meters. Easy shot with the right equipment." "You're talking about using deadly force on a suspect who hasn't killed anyone yet." Sullivan's expression didn't change. "I'm talking about preventing him from killing someone. Your call, Chief, but that man in there is about 30 seconds away from doing something that can't be undone." As if summoned by Sullivan's words, the sound of gunfire cracked across the parking lot. Not the sharp report of a rifle, but the flatter bang of a handgun. Through the windows, they could see the suspect had fired into the ceiling, raining plaster down on the terrified hostages. Martinez felt time slowing down, the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every second he hesitated was another second that innocent people remained in mortal danger. In the distance, he could hear sirens getting closer, but SWAT was still too far away. "How long would you need?" he found himself asking. Sullivan was already moving toward his truck. 5 minutes to get in position. The Barrett still in my vehicle. Martinez made the decision that would haunt him for years to come. Do it. Jake Sullivan moved with a purpose Martinez had never seen before. Gone was the quiet, haunted man from the shooting range. In his place was the soldier who had earned legendary status in the mountains of Afghanistan. Sullivan retrieved the Barrett from his truck with mechanical precision, along with a spotting scope and a rangefinder that looked military-grade. "I need someone to spot for me," Sullivan said, his voice now carrying the clipped authority of battlefield command. "Someone who can confirm the target and call wind." Martinez found himself nodding. "I can do that." They moved quickly but quietly around the back of the diner, using Sullivan's truck to screen their movement from the windows. The ridge Sullivan had identified rose about 50 feet behind the building, covered with scrub pine and offering excellent concealment. As they climbed, Martinez could hear more shouting from inside the diner, punctuated by what sounded like furniture being overturned. At the crest of the ridge, Sullivan went to work with practiced efficiency. He deployed a bipod, adjusted the Barrett's scope, and used the rangefinder to confirm the distance. 298 meters, he announced quietly. Wind is negligible, maybe 2 miles per hour from the west. Through his binoculars, Martinez could see the suspect more clearly now. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with the gaunt look of someone deep in the grip of addiction. His movements were erratic, alternating between aggressive gestures at the hostages and paranoid glances toward the windows. "I can see a .38 revolver," Martinez reported. "Looks like he's got 5 rounds left, assuming he started with 6 and fired 1 into the ceiling." Sullivan had settled behind the rifle, his body taking on the stillness that Martinez now recognized as the mark of an expert marksman. "Confirm target identification," Sullivan said quietly. Martinez felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what Sullivan was asking. This wasn't a military engagement against enemy combatants. This was a civilian police action, and Martinez was being asked to designate an American citizen for death. "Jake, wait!" The sound of screaming from the diner cut off his protest. Through the windows, they could see the suspect had grabbed a teenage girl, probably 16 or 17, and was pressing the gun to her head. The girl's terrified sobs carried clearly across the distance. "Target confirmed," Martinez heard himself saying. Sullivan's breathing slowed to the measured rhythm Martinez had observed at the range. The Barrett's muzzle moved almost imperceptibly as Sullivan tracked the suspect through the scope. Seconds stretched like hours. "He's using the girl as a shield," Sullivan murmured. "I need him to move 6 inches to his left." As if responding to Sullivan's need, the suspect shifted positions slightly, angling his body to shout something at the other hostages. For just a moment, his head and upper torso were clear of the girl. The Barrett spoke once. The .50 caliber bullet crossed the 298 meters in less than half a second. Martinez, watching through binoculars, saw the suspect's head snap back as if he'd been hit by an invisible hammer. The man dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. The revolver skittered across the linoleum, coming to rest harmlessly against the base of the counter. For a moment, the diner was silent except for the sobbing of the hostages. Then chaos erupted as people scrambled toward the exits, and Martinez's officers rushed the building to secure the scene. "Clean kill," Sullivan said matter-of-factly, already beginning to break down the rifle. "No suffering." Martinez stared at him, struggling to process what had just happened. In the space of less than 5 minutes, Jake Sullivan had transformed from a haunted veteran into a precision instrument of death, taken a human life with casual efficiency, and was now packing his equipment as if he'd just finished a day at the range. "Jake," Martinez began, but Sullivan cut him off. "I know what you're thinking, Chief. You're wondering if I enjoyed that, if some part of me was glad to be back in action." Sullivan's hands never paused in their methodical work. "The answer is no, but I'm also not going to pretend that girl wouldn't be dead right now if I hadn't taken that shot." Martinez looked down at the diner, where paramedics were already attending to the shaken hostages. The teenage girl was being comforted by her mother, both of them crying but alive. The suspect lay under a white sheet. His story ended with surgical precision. "What happens now?" Martinez asked. Sullivan shouldered the rifle case and looked at him with tired eyes. "Now you go down there and do your job. Write your reports, answer questions from investigators, deal with the media circus that's about to descend on your little town." He paused, studying Martinez's face. And you try not to think too hard about how easy it was to watch me kill a man. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of interviews, paperwork, and phone calls. The Montana State Police Bureau of Criminal Investigation took over the scene, as was standard protocol for any officer-involved shooting. The fact that the actual shooter wasn't technically a police officer complicated matters considerably. Detective Sarah Chen from the State Bureau was a small, intense woman in her 40s who had the reputation for being both thorough and fair. She arrived 6 hours after the shooting and immediately began separating the various players to get their individual accounts. Martinez found himself in his own office, being interviewed like a suspect in his own building. Chen had been professional but persistent, going over every detail of the encounter multiple times. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Chief Martinez," Chen said, reviewing her notes for the third time. "You made the decision to involve a civilian consultant in an active hostage situation?" "Mr. Sullivan offered his assistance based on his military experience and expertise," Martinez replied carefully. "Given the circumstances and the immediate threat to civilian lives, I authorized his involvement." "His expertise being his background as a sniper," Martinez nodded. "Among other things, yes." Chen leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Chief, I've been investigating officer-involved shootings for 12 years. I've never seen anything quite like this. You essentially deputized a civilian to conduct what amounts to an assassination." The word hit Martinez like a physical blow. "Detective, that man was seconds away from killing innocent people. Mr. Sullivan prevented a massacre." "I'm not disputing the outcome," Chen said. "Every hostage survived, and by all accounts, the suspect was indeed preparing to harm them. But the methods," she trailed off, shaking her head. "It's going to raise questions, lots of them." Those questions came faster than Martinez had anticipated. By the second day, news crews from 3 major networks had set up camp in the parking lot of the police station. The story had everything the media loved: a small-town crisis, a mysterious military hero, and enough moral ambiguity to fuel days of talking-head debates. The narrative that emerged in the press was both more and less complicated than the reality. Jake Sullivan was alternately portrayed as a troubled veteran whose violent skills had no place in civilian law enforcement, and as a heroic figure who had saved innocent lives when the system failed to protect them. Martinez found himself fielding calls from reporters, civil rights lawyers, and military historians, all wanting his perspective on what the media had dubbed the Montana incident. The phrase made him wince every time he heard it. On the third day, Sullivan appeared at the police station looking even more worn than usual. He'd clearly been avoiding the media circus, but something had drawn him out of hiding. "I came to apologize," Sullivan said when Martinez invited him into his office. "For what?" "For putting you in this position. I should have realized that involving me would create complications for you and your department." Martinez studied the man across from his desk. Sullivan looked like he hadn't slept in days, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that hadn't been there before the shooting. "Jake, you saved lives. That girl will spend the rest of her life knowing that she lived because I killed someone. Her parents will always think of me as the man who shot another human being to protect their daughter." Sullivan's voice was flat, emotionless. "Do you think that makes her feel better or worse about what happened?" Martinez didn't have an answer for that. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," Sullivan continued, "about having someone who understands. The truth is, Chief, nobody understands. Nobody can understand what it's like to be really good at killing people, not unless they've been there themselves." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the main street of the small town. News vans lined both sides of the road. Satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. "I thought maybe I'd found a place here, somewhere I could just be Jake Sullivan, not the legendary sniper. But this," he gestured toward the media circus outside, "this is exactly what I've been running from for 5 years, and now I've dragged you into it too." Martinez joined him at the window, watching reporters set up for their evening broadcasts. "So what's your plan?" Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. "I leave. Tonight, probably. Find another small town, another shooting range, another place where maybe nobody will recognize the name Jake Sullivan. Running away again." The question came out harsher than Martinez had intended, but Sullivan didn't flinch. "Yeah, Chief, running away again. Because the alternative is staying here and watching this town tear itself apart over whether I'm a hero or a monster. And I've seen enough places torn apart for one lifetime. Martinez wanted to argue, wanted to tell Sullivan that he was wrong, that the town could handle the controversy. But looking out at the circus that had invaded their quiet streets, he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "What about me?" Martinez asked quietly. "What about what I'm going to have to deal with after you're gone?" Sullivan turned to face him, and for the first time since the shooting, something like emotion flickered in his eyes. "You're going to do what you've always done, Chief. You're going to protect and serve your community. You're going to answer their questions honestly, face the consequences of the decisions you made, and find a way to live with what happened." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll find someone who understands the weight of making life-and-death decisions. Someone who knows what it costs to be good at your job when your job sometimes requires violence." Jake Sullivan disappeared that night, just as he'd promised. Martinez discovered his absence the next morning when he drove to the small motel where Sullivan had been staying. The desk clerk, an elderly man named Frank who'd run the place for 30 years, handed Martinez an envelope with his name written on it in Sullivan's careful script. Inside was a brief note and a business card for a gun dealer in Billings. "Chief Martinez, I've arranged for Pete Hendricks at the shooting range to take possession of the Barrett. If your department ever needs specialized equipment or training, Pete knows how to reach people who can help. The rifle deserves to be used by someone who understands its purpose. Thank you for treating me like a person, instead of a legend. That meant more than you know. Take care of your town." Jake Martinez stood in the motel parking lot, holding the note as morning traffic began to build on the highway. News vans were already setting up for another day of coverage, reporters preparing to dissect every angle of the story they'd labeled the Montana Incident. The irony wasn't lost on him that Sullivan's disappearance would only fuel more speculation and media attention. The mysterious sniper who'd vanished into the night was an even better story than the troubled veteran who'd stayed to face questions. Detective Chen found Martinez at his office an hour later, looking frustrated and tired. "Your consultant has disappeared," she announced without preamble. "I'm aware of that. Chief, this complicates my investigation considerably. I still have questions about the shooting, about his state of mind, about the decision-making process that led to—" "Detective," Martinez interrupted. "Jake Sullivan saved 6 lives 3 days ago. He prevented a massacre, and then he left town because he knew his presence would create more problems than it solved. What more do you need to know?" Chen studied him with the sharp eyes that had made her reputation as an investigator. "I need to know if you'd make the same decision again." The question hung between them like smoke from a discharged rifle. Martinez had been asking himself the same thing for 3 days, turning it over in his mind during sleepless nights and distracted conversations. "Yes," he said finally. "If I had to do it again, knowing what I know now, I'd make the same call, even knowing the controversy it would cause. The questions about protocol and proper procedure." Martinez thought about the teenage girl he'd seen being reunited with her parents, about the other hostages who'd gone home to their families instead of to the morgue. Especially knowing that, Chen made a note in her file. The preliminary findings support a justified shooting. The suspect was clearly threatening civilian lives, and conventional law enforcement response wasn't viable given the tactical situation. She paused, looking up from her paperwork. "But Chief, I've got to tell you, this case is going to follow you for the rest of your career. Every decision you make will be viewed through the lens of the day you authorized a civilian to kill an American citizen." Martinez nodded grimly. He'd already come to that conclusion himself. The media attention continued for another week, gradually fading as newer stories captured the public's interest, but the effects lingered in ways both obvious and subtle. The Riverside Diner reopened, but business was slow as people seemed uncomfortable eating in a place where someone had died violently. The teenage girl who'd been held at gunpoint required extensive counseling and transferred to a school in another district. More personally, Martinez found that his relationship with his officers had changed. Some, like Sergeant Collins, supported his decision and praised his quick thinking in a crisis. Others questioned whether he'd overstepped his authority and put the department at legal risk. The division wasn't dramatic. No one filed complaints or requested transfers, but Martinez could feel it in briefings and casual conversations. There was a guardedness that hadn't been there before, a sense that their chief might make decisions that put them all in uncomfortable positions. His wife, Sarah, as always, provided the clearest perspective. "You saved lives," she said one evening as they sat on their back porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. You made a hard decision in an impossible situation, and innocent people went home to their families because of it. But, Sarah smiled at how well she knew him, but you're wondering if the cost was worth it, if the controversy and the questions and the way people look at you now, if all of that was a fair price for doing the right thing. Martinez sipped his beer, considering her words. Something like that. Robert, in 20 years of marriage, I've watched you make 1,000 difficult decisions. I've seen you talk down domestic abusers and chase armed suspects and sit with dying accident victims. I've never seen you make a decision based on what would be easy or popular or politically safe. She reached over and took his hand. That's why this town elected you chief 3 times. That's why your officers follow you, even when they don't understand your choices. And that's why I'm proud to be married to you. 2 months after Jake Sullivan vanished, Martinez received an unexpected phone call. The number wasn't one he recognized, but the voice was unmistakable. "Chief, it's Jake Sullivan." Martinez felt his pulse quicken. "Jake, where are you?" "Wyoming, little town called Riverside, about 100 miles south of you. I'm working at a ranch, helping with maintenance and security." There was a pause. "Listen, I'm calling because I heard about what's been happening up there." Martinez frowned. "What do you mean?" "The investigation findings, the media follow-up stories, the questions about your judgment. I've been keeping tabs on the fallout from what we did." "Jake, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." Sullivan's voice was firm. "Chief, I left you holding the bag for a decision we made together. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." Martinez walked to his office window, looking out at the street where news vans had parked for a week. The media circus was long gone, but the memories remained vivid. "The state investigation cleared both of us," Martinez said. "Justified shooting, proper use of force, given the circumstances. The controversy has mostly died down. But it cost you something." It wasn't a question, and Martinez found himself appreciating Sullivan's insight. "Some relationships with my officers. Trust from parts of the community. Sleep, some nights." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "I want to come back." "Jake, that's not a good idea. Things are just getting back to normal here. Your return would give people a chance to ask their questions directly, instead of speculating from a distance," Sullivan finished. "Chief, I've been thinking about this for 2 months. I ran away because I was scared of facing the consequences of my actions, but running away just made things worse for you." Martinez felt a mix of admiration and concern for the man on the other end of the line. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I want to come back and face whatever questions people have, media interviews, town meetings, whatever it takes to clear the air, and then I want to ask you for a job." The request caught Martinez completely off guard. "A job? Your department could use someone with specialized tactical training. I've been doing research. Lots of rural police departments are adding part-time consultants for situations that require military-style expertise. I wouldn't be a sworn officer, but I could provide training, equipment advice, tactical support when needed." Martinez found himself considering the proposal, despite his better judgment. The truth was, the hostage situation had exposed gaps in his department's capabilities that he'd been trying to address for months. "Jake, the political reality is that you need someone who can do what I did at the diner, but within a proper legal framework," Sullivan interrupted. "Someone who can train your officers in advanced marksmanship and tactical response. Someone who understands the weight of making life-and-death decisions and can help others prepare for those moments." Martinez was quiet, thinking through the implications. Having Sullivan return would certainly generate renewed media attention, but it might also put some of the lingering questions to rest. And the practical benefits of having his expertise available. "There's something else," Sullivan continued. "I've been working with a therapist down here, someone who specializes in combat veterans transitioning to civilian life. It's helping. I think I'm finally starting to understand how to live with what I've done, both over there and here." The change in Sullivan's voice was subtle but unmistakable. There was a steadiness that hadn't been there before, a sense of resolution that suggested real healing rather than just coping. "When would you want to do this?" Martinez asked. "Next week, if you're willing. I figure it's better to face the music sooner rather than later." Martinez looked around his office, taking in the commendations and photos that chronicled 20 years in law enforcement. On his desk was a framed picture from the diner incident, not of the shooting but of the reunited hostages with their families. The teenage girl was smiling, her arm around her mother, both of them alive because of a decision he and Sullivan had made together. "All right," he said finally. "Come back. We'll face whatever comes together." "Thank you, Chief." "Jake," Martinez added, before the man could hang up, "when you get here, come by the house first. Sarah wants to meet the man who helped save those people. She's been after me to invite you for dinner for 2 months." For the first time since Martinez had known him, Jake Sullivan laughed, a genuine sound of surprised joy that carried clearly across the phone line. "I'd like that, Chief. I'd like that a lot." As Martinez hung up the phone, he realized he was smiling. Outside his window, the town continued its daily rhythm, unaware that the mysterious sniper who'd vanished into legend was preparing to return. There would be challenges ahead: media attention, community debates, difficult conversations about violence and justice, and the price of safety. But there would also be something that had been missing from the story until now: the chance for redemption, understanding, and perhaps even healing for 2 men who'd made an impossible choice in an impossible moment. Jake Sullivan returned to town on a Tuesday morning in early November, driving the same beat-up Ford pickup he'd left in 2 months earlier. Martinez watched from his office window as Sullivan parked across from the police station, taking a moment to survey the street before getting out of the truck. The media attention had died down considerably, but word of Sullivan's return had leaked somehow. A small cluster of reporters waited on the sidewalk, along with perhaps 24 townspeople drawn by curiosity. Martinez noted that the crowd seemed more curious than hostile, which he took as a positive sign. Sullivan walked directly to the police station, ignoring the shouted questions from reporters. He looked different than when he'd left, still lean and weathered, but carrying himself with less of the haunted wariness that had defined him before. His eyes, when he shook Martinez's hand, were clearer than they'd been since their first meeting. "Ready for this?" Martinez asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Sullivan replied. "Thank you for giving me the chance." They'd agreed that Sullivan would hold a press conference at the town hall, followed by an open community meeting that evening. It wasn't the usual way these things were handled, but nothing about Sullivan's situation had been usual from the beginning. The press conference was standing room only. Reporters from regional newspapers, local television stations, and even a few national outlets had made the drive to the small Montana town. Sullivan sat at a simple table with Martinez beside him, facing a room full of cameras and skeptical faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sullivan began, his voice steady and clear, "2 months ago, I made a decision that saved innocent lives, but also raised serious questions about the use of force in our communities. I left town because I was afraid to face those questions. I was wrong to do that, and I want to start by apologizing to Chief Martinez and the people of this community for leaving them to deal with the consequences of my actions." A reporter from the Billings Gazette raised her hand. "Mr. Sullivan, do you regret taking that shot?" Sullivan was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same deliberation he'd once applied to long-range targeting calculations. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that a man died and that his family is grieving. I regret that innocent people had to witness violence. But do I regret preventing what would have been multiple murders? No, I don't." Another reporter followed up. "Critics have said that your involvement represented a dangerous militarization of civilian law enforcement. How do you respond to that?" "I think that's a fair concern," Sullivan said, surprising some in the room. Military tactics and civilian policing serve different purposes, and the line between them shouldn't be crossed lightly. What happened at the diner was an exceptional situation that required exceptional measures. It shouldn't become a template for routine police work. Martinez found himself impressed by Sullivan's thoughtfulness. The man had clearly spent his months in Wyoming preparing for this moment, thinking through not just what to say, but how to frame the larger issues at stake. The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from Sullivan's military record to his plans for the future. Through it all, he remained calm and direct, neither defensive about his actions nor cavalier about their implications. When the formal press conference ended, Sullivan did something unexpected. Instead of leaving immediately, he walked to the back of the room where Jessica Thompson, the teenage girl from the diner, sat with her parents. Martinez watched as Sullivan approached the family, his steps hesitant for the first time all day. The girl's father tensed, but Jessica herself stood and faced the man who had saved her life. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, her words barely audible over the noise of departing reporters, "and to tell you that I'm okay. I mean, I have nightmares sometimes, and I'm seeing a counselor, but I'm okay. Sullivan's composure finally cracked, just slightly. I'm glad, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I think about you every day, all of you. I hope you can have a normal life. I can because you saved it, Jessica replied. Then, surprising everyone including herself, she stepped forward and hugged him. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but Martinez saw something change in Sullivan's face, a release of tension he'd been carrying like a physical weight. When the girl stepped back, Sullivan looked more at peace than Martinez had ever seen him. The community meeting that evening filled the town hall beyond capacity. Unlike the press conference, this gathering was for local residents only, people who lived in the community that had been thrust into the national spotlight by the events at the diner. Martinez had expected anger, criticism, and hard questions about his decision to involve Sullivan. What he found instead was a more complex mix of emotions and perspectives. Frank Hendricks, Pete's brother who owned the hardware store, spoke first. Chief Martinez, I've known you for 15 years. You've always put this community first, and I believe you did that day at the diner too. But I want to understand, how do we know when it's appropriate to call in someone like Mr. Sullivan? Where's the line? It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question Martinez had hoped for, challenging but constructive. Frank, that's something we need to work out together as a community, Martinez replied. What happened at the diner was unprecedented. We had seconds to make a decision that could mean the difference between life and death for innocent people. I made the call I thought was right, but you're right that we need clearer guidelines for the future. Sarah Chen, the state detective who had investigated the shooting, had stayed for the community meeting. She stood to address the crowd. I've investigated over 200 officer-involved shootings in my career, she said. What happened here was unusual, yes, but it was also textbook in terms of threat assessment and response. A clear and immediate danger to innocent life, no viable alternatives, and precise execution that minimized collateral damage. From a law enforcement perspective, this was a model response to an extreme situation. The validation from an outside expert seemed to ease some concerns in the room, but it was Sullivan himself who provided the most compelling perspective. I want to be clear about something, he said, standing to address the crowd. I'm not a hired gun. I'm not someone who takes violence lightly. Every person I killed in military service, and the man I killed here, weighs on me. It changes you taking a life even when it's necessary. He paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from supportive to skeptical to simply curious. But I've learned something in the past few months. Running from that weight doesn't make it go away. It just makes you carry it alone. What I'd like to do, if Chief Martinez and this community will have me, is find a way to use my skills in service of life rather than death. Martinez stood to explain the proposal they'd developed. Mr. Sullivan has offered to work with our department as a tactical consultant. He would help train our officers in advanced marksmanship and crisis response. He would provide equipment expertise and tactical advice. And yes, in extreme situations like what we faced at the diner, his specialized skills would be available if needed. But, Martinez continued, this wouldn't be a vigilante arrangement. Mr. Sullivan would work within established protocols and legal frameworks. His role would be defined by policy, not by crisis moment decisions. The discussion that followed was frank and sometimes heated, but it was also productive. Concerns were raised about accountability, oversight, and the precedent such an arrangement might set. Solutions were proposed, debated, and refined. In the end, the community didn't vote. This wasn't that kind of decision. But Martinez could sense a general acceptance of the proposal, a willingness to try something new in response to the realities of modern threats. As the meeting wound down, Martinez found himself standing outside the town hall with Sullivan, watching people walk home through the crisp November night. Think it'll work? Sullivan asked. I think we'll make it work, Martinez replied. It won't be perfect, and there'll be challenges we haven't thought of yet, but it's a start. Sullivan nodded, looking up at the clear mountain sky where stars were beginning to emerge. You know, Chief, for the first time in years, I can see a future that doesn't involve running away from my past. What do you see? Sullivan was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I see using what I learned in the army to protect people instead of just eliminating threats. I see working with officers who understand both the power and the responsibility that comes with deadly force. I see maybe finding some peace with who I am and what I've done. Martinez clapped him on the shoulder. I see all that too. Plus, Sarah's making pot roast tomorrow night, and she's been threatening to hunt you down personally if you don't show up for dinner. For the second time since Martinez had known him, Jake Sullivan laughed, a sound of genuine contentment that carried across the quiet street. 3 months later, Officer Patricia Gonzalez would make a precision shot at 400 meters to stop an armed suspect threatening a school bus, using skills she'd learned in Sullivan's marksmanship training program. The shot would be clean, precise, and would save 23 children from potential harm. When reporters asked her about the training that made the shot possible, Gonzalez would simply say, "We learned from the best." Jake Sullivan, watching the coverage from the police station where he now worked as senior tactical consultant, would allow himself a small smile. For the first time since that day in Afghanistan, when he'd made an impossible shot across an impossible distance, his legendary precision had served not the machinery of war, but the preservation of innocent life. The Barrett. 50 remained locked in the department's weapons vault, rarely used but always ready. A tool of last resort in the hands of people who understood both its power and its cost. Like Sullivan himself, it had found a new purpose, not to make legends, but to protect the peace that allows ordinary people to live ordinary lives. In small Montana towns, that was perhaps the greatest achievement of all.